Hey guys, tonight we have a story that might sound too odd to be real, but I promise every word of it comes from a sleepy little corner of my childhood. Imagine a quiet countryside, the kind where crickets chirp like they're performing a nightly symphony, and the wind gently nudges the trees like an old friend. The kind of place where time seems to take long, slow breaths. You might not have experienced this before, unless you've stayed the night in a creaky wooden house miles from the nearest grocery store, listening to frogs croak outside your window. If that sounds like your kind of evening, you're in for a treat. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and let this story carry you gently into sleep. All right, now let's get into today's diary entry. I was around 10 when it happened, and I'd been sent to spend the summer with my grandparents. They lived in a rural part of northern Japan, Hida to be exact, where the air smelled like cedarwood and damp soil, and the closest neighbor was a 15-minute bike ride away. The house itself was a charming mix of quiet history and everyday chaos. It had sliding paper doors, a steep, groaning staircase, and a roof that whispered with the breeze. You could hear everything in that house, from mice scratching in the attic to your own heartbeat when the rain drummed on the shingles. That evening, I remember we had roasted sweet potatoes for dinner. My grandmother made them in the clay oven out back, wrapping each potato in newspaper and letting them sit under the glowing embers until the skin turned charred and flaky. We ate them on the engawa, the wooden porch that wrapped around the back of the house, while watching the fireflies blink in and out like shy stars. My grandfather, as usual, wore his pale blue yukata and straw slippers. He sat beside me, slurping his tea and glancing up at the darkening sky. "Did I ever tell you about the time I scared a raccoon with nothing but garlic?" he asked, scratching his head like he was trying to remember if the story was true. "No, Grandpa, but I'd like to hear it," I said, already preparing myself for one of his famously strange tales. "It came sneaking into the garden, thinking it could steal a cucumber or two, but I caught it right in the act. Held out a clove of garlic and yelled, 'Shoo!' like some kind of vegetable samurai. You should have seen the way it ran." He laughed to himself, his shoulders shaking quietly. I smiled, not sure whether to believe him, but that was the beauty of his stories. They sat somewhere between fact and dream. After dinner, Grandma made us brush our teeth with salt. She believed it built strong gums, and tucked us under mosquito nets that made our futons look like secret tents. The night air crept in through the slightly cracked window, cool and scented with wildflowers and distant wood smoke. I was just about to fall asleep when I heard a low thud outside, then another, and then a sound like something dragging across the earth. It was the kind of noise that didn't fit into the sleepy rhythm of rural life. I sat up, eyes wide, and listened harder. Outside, the peach trees rustled. There was a sharp snap of a branch breaking, followed by the faintest grunt. I thought maybe it was one of the neighbor's cows, but the sound didn't feel like something tame. It had weight, presence, like it didn't care who was listening. Then I heard the wooden floor creak outside my room. Grandpa was up. So was my uncle, who lived just down the hill, but often stayed the night when the cicadas screamed too loud to sleep. I tiptoed out to the hallway and saw them standing in the dim glow of the porch light. Grandma was already there, clutching a candle and muttering something about how the gods must be playing tricks again. "What was that?" I whispered. Grandpa looked over his shoulder, calm as a monk. "Something's in the peaches." Uncle frowned. "You think it's a wild boar?" Grandpa shrugged. Could be worse." And just like that, the quiet, predictable rhythm of the night had tilted. Something was outside, and no one seemed entirely sure what it was. Grandpa always had a strange way of preparing for emergencies. While most people might have reached for a flashlight or a phone, though back then cell phones weren't really a thing out there, he went straight to the kitchen. I watched as he opened the drawer beside the stove and pulled out his old bamboo soup ladle. It was stained from years of miso broth and dashi stock, and the handle had a small crack in it. He held it up like it was Excalibur. "Just in case," he said with a little wink. Uncle, on the other hand, was a bit more practical. He reached for a long-handled broom that leaned against the back door, gripping it like a spear. My aunt, who had just woken up and wrapped herself in a quilt like a burrito, shuffled in and grabbed a heavy iron frying pan from the stovetop. She squinted through her thick glasses and whispered, "What is it?" Another stray dog. Grandma just rolled her eyes. No dog makes that kind of ruckus. We were all standing in a tight cluster now, barely breathing like some bizarre family of nighttime vigilantes, armed with kitchen tools and farming implements, hearts pounding in the dim candlelight. The strange noise came again, a loud sniffing sound followed by the sound of fruit dropping one by one into the ground. Plop, 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 Peaches, Grandpa muttered. That tree is heavy with them this year. I peeked through the small, square window above the sink. The moon was bright enough to light up the garden like a black and white photograph. And right near the edge of the orchard, something large was moving slow, deliberate, and definitely not a raccoon. Should we call someone? My aunt asked. We are someone, Grandpa replied simply. Besides, it's probably more scared of us than we are of it. No one looked convinced, especially not Uncle, who was now holding the broom like he might try fencing with it. And then Grandpa did something no one expected. He walked to the back door, slid it open just a crack, and stepped outside, barefoot, in nothing but his yukata, with a soup ladle. We all froze. The door creaked as it closed behind him, and the only sound left inside was Grandma's quiet sigh and the ticking of the old wall clock. I ran to the window and crouched beside it, trying to stay hidden as I peeked out. There he was, our fearless leader, calmly making his way down the stone path toward the orchard. The wind caught the hem of his robe, and the ladle swung at his side like a loose pendulum. The creature stopped moving. I could see it now, sort of. A bulky shadow near the base of the peach tree, hunched and round. It didn't run, didn't snarl. It just turned its head slightly as if noticing Grandpa for the first time. They faced each other like old enemies, reunited after decades. From inside, Aunt hissed, "Is he insane?" Uncle tightened his grip on the broom. "He's going to get himself eaten." But Grandma stayed oddly still. She wasn't watching the window. She just stood there, arms folded, whispering softly under her breath, like she'd seen this movie before and knew exactly how it ended. Out in the yard, Grandpa raised the ladle and banged it twice on the rim of a metal watering can. Clang, clang! The sound echoed like a bell through the quiet hills. Then he shouted not a scream, not a growl, just a sharp, perfectly clear command. "Get tea." The creature flinched, and for the first time I saw it clearly as it turned under the moonlight. It was a bear, a real bear. Not huge, but still a bear. Its fur was shaggy and matted, and its nose was shiny with peach juice. It blinked as if confused that someone would charge it with nothing but a piece of kitchenware. Then Grandpa took one slow, deliberate step forward. The bear let out a low grunt, not angry, more surprised. Flang. He banged the ladle again, and just like that, the bear turned and lumbered away, first into the tall grass, then toward the tree line, and finally vanishing into the forest beyond, leaving a trail of half-eaten peaches behind. Back inside, there was a stunned silence. "He chased a bear," Uncle whispered. With a ladle, Aunt added. I couldn't stop laughing, partly from relief, partly because it was so absurd. My grandfather, the quietest man I knew, had just chased off a bear like it was a nosy neighbor. Grandpa came back in moments later, brushing dust from his sleeves and shaking his head like he was annoyed more than anything. "Messy eater," he muttered, walking straight into the kitchen and putting the ladle back where it belonged, right beside the soy sauce. And that was it, like nothing had happened. He went back to bed, and the rest of us just stood there, trying to process what we'd seen. I barely slept that night. Not out of fear, though I'll admit I kept imagining the bear sneaking back in with reinforcements, but more from the buzzing excitement of what had just happened. It felt like I'd witnessed a myth being born. Outside, the peach trees swayed gently in the wind, looking harmless again, and the moonlight painted soft silver puddles on the tatami floor near my futon. I could still hear a few peaches dropping every now and then, probably from branches the bear had shaken. Grandma shuffled past in the early hours to check the sliding door, making sure it was latched tight. She didn't say anything to me, just gave a little smile, the kind that said, "It's over now," and returned to her room with her candle. But by morning, the house felt different. As the sun spilled through the paper windows, the mood had shifted. The kind of shift that happens when a family quietly agrees that what they saw last night was in fact real, and now had to be talked about. At breakfast, no one mentioned the bear right away. Grandpa sat there slurping his miso soup as if nothing had changed. He had even trimmed the wild hairs from his eyebrows like he had some important appointment later. Aunt was the first to break. She poured herself tea and muttered, "So, that really was a bear, wasn't it?" Uncle nodded. "Sure looked like one. Big, too." "I thought I was dreaming," she added, looking over at Grandpa. "You didn't even flinch." Grandpa took a long sip, then set his bowl down. Didn't flinch because I knew what it was. We all waited. He glanced up. It was just hungry. No need to panic. I remember blinking slowly. Just hungry. "You could have been mauled," Uncle said, his voice rising slightly. "I didn't get mauled," Grandpa replied calmly, "because I told it to leave." Aunt rubbed her temples. "With a ladle?" Grandpa grinned. "It's all in the tone." There was a pause, then Uncle leaned back and said, "Well, I'm not going outside without a walk from now on." That got a chuckle from all of us. Later that morning, I ventured outside, drawn by the smell of damp soil and the faint sweetness of crushed peaches. The orchard looked disturbed, not ruined, but definitely shaken. A few broken branches hung awkwardly low, and the grass had been flattened where the bear must have stood. I picked up a peach that had a huge bite taken out of it. The teeth marks were wide and messy, like someone had taken a bite with mittens on. I kept it. Not to eat, of course, but because it felt like a souvenir from the strangest night of my life. I wandered around the tree, trying to picture how it had all unfolded. The bear standing here, Grandpa standing there, the clang of the ladle echoing through the valley. It all felt like a scene from some folk story I might read in an old book, the kind with hand-drawn illustrations and worn-out pages. Then I saw something else. Right by the base of the tree was Grandpa's slipper. Just one. Somehow, he must have lost it during his moonlit march and never noticed. I picked it up and brought it back to the house, holding it like an artifact. Missing something, I asked, holding it out as I walked back into the kitchen. Grandpa looked up from his newspaper. "Ah, that's where it went." Didn't even notice it was gone. He shrugged. "Didn't need both feet to scare a bear." That made me laugh, and he winked like he was proud of himself. By mid-morning, word had already started to spread. Our neighbor, Mrs. Hoshino, showed up with a basket of plums and asked in her usual sing-song voice, "So is it true you shoot a bear with a spoon?" Ladle, Grandpa corrected, not even looking up from his paper. Mrs. Hoshino burst out laughing. "I always said you were a strange one." And just like that, the story began to take on a life of its own. That evening, 2 more neighbors came by to check on us and stayed for tea. They wanted to see where it happened. One of them pointed to the peach trees and said, "That's bear territory now, eh?" "Not anymore," Grandpa said. He got the message. And again, we all laughed. But deep down, I started realizing something. Everyone wasn't just amused, they were kind of impressed. There was admiration in their voices, a gleam in their eyes. And Grandpa, who usually said very little and preferred to sit alone on the porch with his thoughts and a glass of barley tea, had become something else entirely overnight. A bit of a legend. It didn't change him, though. He still got up at dawn, tended to his bonsai, and fed the chickens without a word. But that ladle, he cleaned it extra well that morning and hung it on the wall beside the kitchen window like it was some sort of trophy. From then on, nobody touched it. It wasn't just a kitchen tool anymore. It was the bear ladle. You'd think after a bear encounter, we'd all be a little more careful, set traps, build a fence, maybe even keep a loud radio running at night. But no, life slipped right back into its old rhythm, like the valley had absorbed the whole thing and decided it wasn't worth making a fuss. Well, almost. There were changes, subtle ones. My uncle started carrying a long-handled hoe with him on his morning walks. Aunt began lighting incense sticks around the peach orchard, just in case the spirits want to help keep the animals away. Grandma added an extra pinch of salt to everything, which she claimed was for protection, though she also muttered something about salt keeping vegetables fresh. Even I, when I had to use the outhouse at night, walked faster than usual. You never know what's out there beyond the shadows. But Grandpa, not even a twitch of paranoia. If anything, he seemed more at peace. He took longer walks, whistled more. One morning, I even saw him do a little stretch on the Ngawa arms raised to the sky, like some ancient warrior welcoming the sun. "Don't let fear take root," he said, when I asked why he didn't carry a stick at least. "Once it grows, it's hard to pull out." Still, there was something playful in his tone, like he enjoyed the memory of chasing off a bear with a ladle more than he was letting on. And then came the second surprise. It was about a week later, during a lazy mid-afternoon, when the sun was so strong the cicadas had practically given up buzzing. I was sitting on the porch with a half-melted ice pop in one hand and a comic book in the other, when I heard footsteps crunching up the gravel path. It was two men from the village council, Mr. Nishida and Mr. Kubo, both wearing faded work shirts and straw hats that had clearly seen better days. "Is your grandfather home?" one asked. I called for him, and he appeared moments later wiping his hands on a towel. He had been polishing an old lantern in the back, one of those rusty kerosene types he refused to throw out. "Something wrong?" he asked. "No, no," Mr. Nishida replied. Well, there's been some talk." "Good talk," Mr. Kubo added quickly. They exchanged glances, then explained that word had gotten around faster than anyone expected. Apparently, the postman had overheard someone mentioning the bear incident and told the shopkeeper, who told the rice mill owner, who told his mother-in-law, and by then, the whole village knew. "We were wondering if you might come to the harvest festival," Mr. Nishida said. "As a guest speaker, tell the story." Grandpa raised an eyebrow. "Of the bear." Mr. Kubo smiled. "Of the courage, the ladle, the spirit of our town." For a second, I thought Grandpa would laugh and wave them off. He hated being the center of attention. Once when he won a bottle of soy sauce in a local raffle, he left it on the prize table and pretended it never happened. But this time he didn't say no. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully and said, "I'll think about it." After they left, I stared at him. "You're actually going to do it?" "Maybe," he said, "if the weather's good." Then he winked. That evening, I helped him clean the ladle again, though it was already spotless. We polished the bamboo handle and checked for splinters. Grandpa didn't say much, but his smile said everything. He let me hold it for a moment. It felt light in my hand, almost too ordinary to be part of a story that had grown so big. But in that quiet way of his, Grandpa had turned it into something more. He didn't chase the bear to be a hero. He did it because someone had to. Because the peaches were part of the family too. Later that night, I stayed up listening to the wind rustle through the orchard again. No crashing, no growls, just the usual chorus of frogs and the distant bark of a dog in the next valley over. I felt safer somehow, not because the bear was gone, but because I knew that if it ever came back, Grandpa still had the ladle. The days rolled on, and with them came the unmistakable buzz of festival season. Out in the countryside, we didn't have flashy lights or giant stages, no fireworks that painted the sky like in the city, but our village's harvest festival had its own kind of magic paper lanterns hung from bamboo poles, the smell of grilled corn and sweet rice cakes in the air, and every neighbor wearing a slightly too tight yukata they'd pulled out of storage for the occasion. This year, though, there was a different kind of excitement humming underneath it all, because everyone had heard about the bear and the ladle, and my grandfather, who'd spent decades known mostly as the man who says little and grows the straightest cucumbers, was suddenly a topic of hushed, awed conversation. I remember walking to the village center with him the morning before the festival. We passed by the tofu shop where the owner gave Grandpa a free packet for strength. At the shrine, an old woman bowed deeply and said, "May the mountain spirits keep honoring you." Grandpa gave her a polite nod and kept walking like nothing had happened. But I swear I saw his ears turn just a little bit red. Preparations were already in full swing. The younger kids were practicing their taiko drumming, older men were hanging string lights between the cherry trees, and someone was carving out a sign that read, "Protect the harvest. Be brave like Grandpa Saito." I almost choked on my plum candy when I saw it. "They made a sign?" I asked. Grandpa just grunted. "Hope they spell my name right." By the time evening fell, the whole village had gathered. Little wooden booths lined the path leading to the shrine, selling pickled radish grilled fish and syrupy shaved ice in flavors that barely tasted like the fruits they were named after. The smell of burning incense mixed with fried batter and fresh-cut bamboo. Kids ran around with sparklers while old men sat cross-legged, sipping sake from ceramic cups and arguing about who grew the best taro that year. And then came the announcement. The head of the village, Mr. Sato, who wore a sash, even though no one else did, stepped onto the raised platform beside the shrine bell. He tapped the mic a few times and cleared his throat. "We'd like to thank you all for a bountiful year," he began. "And tonight we honor not only the harvest, but the spirit of courage and calm in the face of danger." I swear the pause he took was longer than the introduction itself. "Please welcome our own grandfather Saito." The crowd clapped. Not a roar, but a warm rolling applause like the sound of rain on a tin roof. Grandpa looked at me then at the platform and muttered, "Let's get this over with." He stepped up slowly. No rush. Still in his faded yukata slippers, dusty from the walk hands behind his back. And what was in his right hand? The ladle? He raised it once for the crowd to see. Just a slight lift, no dramatic flair. Then he spoke. "I didn't chase the bear for glory," he said. "I chased it because it was eating our peaches." The crowd chuckled. "Sometimes," he went on, "you don't need strength. You just need to make enough noise and not run." That was it. Barely a minute. He stepped back down, nodded, and returned to where I was standing. "You didn't want to say more," I whispered. "What else is there to say?" he replied, as someone handed him a stick of grilled mochi on a skewer. But as the night went on, the story grew. I overheard a kid telling his friend that Grandpa had wrestled the bear and shouted so loud it echoed all the way to the next prefecture. Another claimed he saw the bear fall over from fright. By the time the dancing started, someone had even drawn a little cartoon on the lantern stand, a bear running from a tiny man waving a cooking spoon like a sword. I laughed so hard I spilled juice on my shirt. The moon climbed higher and the taiko drums kept the rhythm going until late into the night. Grandpa sat on a stool near the edge of the festival grounds, quietly sipping barley tea, completely at ease. That evening, someone asked him for a photo. He said no, but let them take a picture of the ladle instead. A few days after the festival, the buzz started to fade like summer itself, slowly backing out the door. The lanterns came down, the paper signs peeled off their posts, and the smell of grilled food was replaced by the sharper scent of drying leaves and rice straw. But even as the physical traces disappeared, the story of Grandpa and the bear lingered. It had taken root. I began to notice the strangest little things. At the corner shop, the owner had placed a bamboo ladle by the cash register propped upright in a flower vase, like some kind of rustic mascot. When I asked about it, he just said, "For protection. You never know." Even at school, where I resumed classes at the tiny countryside elementary tucked beside a cedar grove, kids began whispering stories. One girl claimed her grandfather used to be friends with my grandfather and that they once scared off a wild boar together using only harmonicas. I didn't have the heart to tell her that Grandpa couldn't play a note if his life depended on it. But the best part, Grandpa acted as though none of this had changed his life one bit. He went on with his routines, tending to his bonsai trees in the early morning, feeding the chickens at precisely 6:30, and making that same barley tea that tasted like roasted grain and summer air. But every once in a while, when a neighbor passed by and gave him a little salute or asked for the secret ladle technique, he'd give a half smile, adjust his straw hat, and say, "Depends on the bear." To me, though, it was more than just a funny story. One afternoon, I found myself walking the narrow forest path behind our property. I knew the trail well. It wound past a small creek under two leaning pine trees and ended in a shaded clearing full of soft moss and the ruins of an old wooden shed. I used to pretend it was a pirate fort when I was younger. I sat on a fallen log watching a dragonfly hover just above the water surface. For some reason, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. How brave Grandpa had looked, how he hadn't hesitated, and how he wasn't loud or showy about it afterward. I wondered if I'd ever be like that. Not the bear chasing part necessarily, though that was cool in its own way, but the calm part. The part that faces something big, something wild, and doesn't panic. Just thinks, then does. Back at the house, I asked him, "Grandpa," I said, "weren't you scared?" He looked up from his gardening, brushing a bit of soil off his fingers. "Of what?" "The bear." He shrugged. "Of course I was, but fear isn't the problem." "What is?" He reached into the soil and pulled up a stubby carrot. "Letting it stop you." That was all he said. But I thought about that for a long time. In the evenings, I found myself looking forward to just sitting near him. Sometimes we didn't even talk. He'd sip tea, I'd sketch or read. The cicadas would sing, then fall quiet. A breeze would pass through the pine trees, and all I'd hear was the creak of the porch wood under our weight. And there in the soft blue light of dusk, everything made sense. One evening as we sat together, I finally asked, "Do you think the bear will come back?" Grandpa didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of tea, then looked toward the orchard. "If it does," he said, "we'll just let it know who's boss." I smiled. "With the ladle." He grinned. "With whatever we've got." He stood then stretching his arms behind his back and walked inside slippers, making that familiar shuffling sound against the floor. I stayed there a while longer, staring out toward the trees. The truth was, I kind of hoped the bear did come back, just so I could see how Grandpa would handle it all over again. But I also knew it didn't really matter, because even if it didn't, that night was ours. A weird, wonderful page in the diary of our lives. Something no one could take away. And if I ever did face something big and scary one day, I hoped I'd remember how it felt to stand beside someone who didn't need armor or weapons or even shoes. Just a ladle, and the nerve to use it. It wasn't long before the seasons began their slow shift. The air took on a crisper edge, and the orchard leaves, once thick and green, began curling into shades of burnt orange and golden yellow. The peaches were long gone, eaten, preserved, or in one case famously stolen by a bear. And with autumn settling and my summer stay was coming to an end, my parents were due to pick me up in a few days, and I was already dreading the return to city noise homework and sidewalks that didn't crack under your feet like dry earth. Part of me didn't want to leave. The countryside had become more than just a vacation spot. It had become a world where everything made more sense, where even a soup ladle had purpose and the stars seemed closer. One morning I found Grandpa at the workbench beside the chicken coop. He was carving something from wood, his hands moving with the same calm precision I'd come to recognize in everything he did, from slicing daikon to trimming bonsai. "What's that?" I asked, sitting beside him on the wooden stool. "A gift," he said, not looking up. He didn't say more, and I didn't push him. Later that afternoon, after helping Grandma hang freshly laundered futon covers out to dry, I came back to the porch and found a small parcel wrapped in newspaper tied neatly with a piece of old twine. There was no note. I opened it slowly, carefully. Inside was a hand-carved wooden ladle, smaller than the one from the kitchen, smooth and light with my initials burned gently into the handle. I held it in both hands, unsure what to say. "Don't use it on soup," Grandpa said from behind me, startling me slightly. I turned. "What should I use it for?" He shrugged. "Whatever needs doing." Then he gave me that quiet smile, the one that didn't show much on his face but warmed the air around him. I don't think I've ever received a better gift. That evening, my aunt made tempura, and we all ate together on the porch. Grandpa was unusually talkative, telling a story about a festival when he was a child and how he once mistook a masked dancer for a tanuki. Uncle cracked jokes. Grandma laughed so hard her tea sloshed onto her sleeves, and the cicadas, fewer now, but still holding on, sang their familiar evening chorus. As I went to bed, I tucked the carved ladle under my pillow. It felt silly, maybe even a little childish, but it comforted me. It reminded me that courage didn't have to roar. Sometimes it was quiet, carved by hand and shaped by stories. My last night there, I stayed up a little later than usual. I watched the moon rise from the Ngawa, letting my toes rest on the cool wood planks. I thought about how quickly the summer had passed, how everything would soon fade back into routine, and how I didn't want this memory to blur like a dream. I wanted to remember it all: the soft crunch of gravel, the smell of peaches on the wind, the weight of a wooden ladle in my hand, and of course the image of my grandfather standing alone under the moonlight, facing a bear with nothing but common kitchenware. He didn't want to be remembered as a hero, but he became one anyway. The morning of my departure came too soon. The sun rose gently over the hills, casting that golden countryside glow on everything: the orchard, the thatched rooftops, even the laundry line where Grandma's aprons fluttered like sleepy flags. I packed slowly, savoring every moment. Each fold of clothing felt like tucking away a piece of that summer. Like maybe if I folded just right, the scent of wood smoke and sweet miso might come home with me. The carved ladle sat safely at the top of my bag, wrapped in a clean hand towel, and nestled between two t-shirts like a tiny treasure. Grandma made me a special breakfast grilled rice balls, with plum in the middle, my favorite. Uncle stopped by too, dropping off a bag of dried persimmons in case the city forgets how fall is supposed to taste. Aunt insisted on walking me to the road with a huge umbrella, even though the sky was perfectly clear. As I tied my shoes, I glanced over at the peach orchard. The broken branches had long been cleared, and new green shoots had already started to reach upward. If I hadn't known better, I might have thought nothing strange had ever happened there. But I did know, and I would always remember. Grandpa stood by the gate arms, folded loosely straw hat tilted just enough to shadow his eyes. I walked over slowly, my bag bouncing lightly on my shoulder. "Thanks for everything," I said. He nodded. "Be good." I paused, unsure of what to say next. I wanted to tell him what that summer meant, that I'd never look at a ladle or a peach tree or even silence the same way again, that I saw him now more clearly than before, that his quiet strength had stitched itself into a corner of my heart. But instead, I just smiled and said, "If I ever see a bear." He raised an eyebrow. "Ladle first." We both laughed. Then came the familiar sound of the minibus rumbling down the gravel road, kicking up a little trail of dust as it slowed to a stop in front of the house. The driver gave a polite wave, already knowing this was a farewell moment worth pausing for. I climbed aboard and took a window seat. As the engine hummed back to life, I leaned out the window, waving with one hand, the other holding the strap of my bag. Grandpa raised his hand once, fingers slightly curled the way he always waved goodbye. Not too much, not too little. Just enough. The trees blurred past as we drove away the orchard, slipping out of view. I turned back in my seat and let my head rest against the glass. I didn't cry, but I carried something with me. Not just memories, not just the carved ladle. I carried a story, one that I would tell again and again, not because it was unbelievable, but because it reminded me that bravery can be quiet, that strength doesn't always shout, and that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one holding a soup ladle like it's a sword. Even now, years later, I keep that ladle in a drawer beside my desk. I don't use it for anything practical, but on quiet nights, I'll sometimes take it out and hold it for a moment. And if I listen closely, I can still hear the clang of bamboo against metal and the sound of peaches falling into the grass under a summer moon. I thought things might quiet down after the bear. You'd think a night like that would be the peak of countryside chaos, but living with Grandpa had a way of bending those expectations. The next week passed in that slow, golden rhythm I loved most, days that smelled like drying persimmons, and nights filled with the hum of crickets trying their best to out-sing each other. It was early autumn by then. The leaves had only just started their quiet shift from deep green to dusty orange. Most mornings the air was crisp enough that Grandma would wrap her scarf tight around her neck, even inside the house, while she boiled rice and hummed songs I never knew the names of. Grandpa's chickens, who had names like Miso Button and One Eye, were still clucking their way around the yard like feathery philosophers. They weren't exactly normal chickens either. They didn't live in a proper coop, just sort of existed. Perched under the porch on the rafters sometimes in the old sink that Grandpa never bothered to remove. He always said, "Let animals be strange. They remember things we forget." One of them, a small brown hen with a perpetually crooked tail, had taken a liking to Grandma. She'd follow her around the house clucking, as if giving commentary on whatever she was cooking. If Grandma was chopping daikon, the hen clucked once. If she was frying tofu, 3 clucks. We had no idea why. That morning started like any other. A bowl of miso soup, the rustle of the newspaper, and Grandpa's usual ritual of checking the sky to decide whether or not it was worth watering the eggplants. Then the roof clattered. It was sharp and sudden, like someone had dropped a box of firewood right above the kitchen. We all froze. Grandma paused mid-sip. Grandpa raised an eyebrow, and I put down my bowl of pickled radish, listening. It came again, a loud scrape, then a shuffle, followed by an unmistakable sound. Bauk. A chicken? 101. I glanced at Grandpa, waiting for some kind of reaction. Nothing. Another thump. Then the sound of soft scratching like talons on tile. I stood up and walked to the back door, peeking out toward the yard. Everything looked normal. But then I noticed a feather drifting lazily down from the roof's edge. Not just one, several. Little tufts catching the breeze like tiny sails. I stepped out onto the Ngawa and craned my neck up toward the roofline. And there they were, 3 chickens on the roof, just standing there. One was pacing along the ridge like a balance beam, another was scratching at a tile, and the third was sitting proudly like it had finally claimed its own mountain. I blinked, not sure if I was still dreaming. Then without thinking, I called out Grandpa there on the roof. No response. I turned around expecting surprise or maybe concern. But Grandpa was still at the table sipping tea like nothing was happening. Grandma had gone back to her pickles. "Aren't you going to check?" I asked, pointing upward. Grandpa looked at me over the rim of his cup. "They'll come down when they're ready." "They're chickens," I said. "They don't belong on roofs." Grandpa tilted his head. "You ever ask them?" That was the thing about him. He had a way of turning your most logical protests into silence with just a few words. You could either argue or you could watch the chickens. I watched. One of them flapped its wings suddenly, nearly lost its balance, then somehow managed to stay upright. I swear it looked proud. From inside, Aunt called, "Don't let them lay eggs up there." The last time they did, we didn't find them until they hatched on the stove. I didn't even know that had happened. Grandpa didn't flinch. He just said, "Then they must have liked the view." By mid-morning, the chickens were still up there, casual as you please, as if rooftops were their birthright. Every now and then, one would shuffle along the tiles with a kind of dramatic flare wings, half spread for balance. Another would cluck loudly, then peck at absolutely nothing like it was inspecting the integrity of the roof itself. I sat on the edge of the porch, chewing a dried sweet potato strip, trying to figure out how they'd even gotten up there. We didn't have any nearby trees that reached that high, and the water barrels were at least a meter away. Grandpa's ladder was still leaning against the shed untouched. It felt less like a simple accident and more like intent, as if they'd planned it. I walked around the yard looking for clues. Maybe they'd climbed the woodpile, used the rain gutter as a launch pad. One of them, Button, I think saw me watching and gave a long drawn-out whack like she was taunting me. Feathers drifted from above, catching in my hair. I went back inside and sat across from Grandpa, who was now slowly peeling an apple with his pocket knife, the skin curling off in a perfect ribbon. "Still up there," I said. He didn't look up. "They've been there before." I blinked. "Wait, really?" He nodded slowly. "First time was 10 years ago. Miso did it first. Took her nearly 2 hours to get down. And you didn't stop her." He shrugged. "Chickens know what they're doing. Most of the time." I wasn't so sure. One of them had just squatted near the edge of the roof like it was about to do something deeply regrettable. And what if they fall? They'll flap. What if they lay eggs up there? They're fun. They'll hatch. What if they never come down? Grandpa paused, then finally looked at me with the faintest smirk. "Then we'll have sky chickens." I sighed. Aunt wandered in around then with a towel over her shoulder, halfway through cleaning the bathhouse. She paused when she saw my face. "What's wrong with you?" "The chickens are still on the roof." She groaned. "Not again." I felt a strange relief wash over me. So I wasn't crazy. This had happened before. "They come down when they get hungry," she added. Usually, I asked. "Well, unless someone throws rice." So that became the plan. Aunt fetched a small bowl of cooked rice, still warm from breakfast, and walked out into the yard like someone summoning spirits. She called up, "Come on, you little roof ghosts, look what I've got." One of them leaned over the edge slightly, just enough to see, then turned away like we weren't worth its time. "Rude," Aunt muttered. I tried banging a pot. Nothing. Grandpa stepped outside with a rice cracker in hand, bit off a corner and whistled. Not a fancy whistle, just a casual one, like he was calling an old friend. And to my complete surprise, one of the chickens turned. It stared at him for a long moment, then flapped once, then jumped. Wings fluttering, body awkward, it landed hard, but upright on the dirt, shook itself, and strutted away like the whole thing had been intentional. Aunt clapped once. "See, they just need encouragement." But the others, no movement. They stayed right where they were, one standing proudly like a statue, the other nesting, feathers puffed up. I lay on my back in the yard, staring up at the sky, the chickens, and the thin wisps of clouds above them. Button tilted her head and stared down at me. I stared back. A feather floated down and landed on my nose. I didn't move. Eventually, Grandpa sat beside me and handed me half of his rice cracker. "You ever wonder what they're thinking?" he asked. "All the time," he nodded. "Maybe they think the roof is safer than the ground." "Well, he said we chased off a bear last week. If I were a chicken, I'd want high ground too." I had to admit that made more sense than I wanted it to. The chickens weren't just being weird. They were being cautious. Or maybe curious. Or maybe they were just chickens. And we were the ones trying too hard to understand something that didn't need understanding. Still, the mystery of how they got up there remained. And the longer they stayed, the more it started to feel like they weren't just perching, they were planning something. Aunt tried calling the neighbor's son to help with a ladder. Grandpa waved her off. "If you climb up there, they'll just fly to the other side." He had a point. So we waited. I stayed on the porch most of the day, eyes drifting from book to rooftop, watching as the afternoon light turned everything gold. And Button, still on the ridge, took a deep breath, fluffed her feathers, and closed her eyes, as if she'd always belonged in the sky. By late afternoon, the chickens had settled in like rooftop royalty. Two of them were now lounging in a shallow dip between the roof tiles, looking far too comfortable for creatures without hands or hammocks. The third Button, of course, remained stationed at the highest point, perched with the solemn authority of a temple guardian. And that's when the feathers started to fall. Not just a stray one here or there. This was a slow, steady drift, like the sky itself was molting. They floated down in lazy spirals, catching in the eaves, sticking to the laundry line, even landing in the teacup I had forgotten on the porch railing. "Snowing chickens," Grandpa muttered from behind me, poking his head out the door. I looked up, shielding my eyes. Should we be worried? Only if they start laying eggs on the chimney. Aunt came outside with a straw hat pulled low over her face, in a broom in hand. "I just cleaned the futons. If a hen lays on them, I'm turning one into stew." Grandma, who had barely reacted all day, finally stepped out with a small bowl of sesame crackers. She peered up at the roof and nodded to herself. "They do this when the weather shifts. Restless bones." That sounded like something Grandpa would say, but she delivered it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had seen too many things to argue about them anymore. As we stood there debating poultry psychology, Button began to pace. One careful step after another, balancing like a tightrope. Walker wings out ever so slightly for balance. The angle of her body shifted with each tile. She moved with purpose until she reached the edge, looked down at all of us, and let out one long, low bwack that felt suspiciously like judgment. "She's trying to figure out if we're worth returning to," I whispered. Grandpa nodded. That one always had ideas. Ideas. Apparently, Button had once figured out how to open the feed storage box with her beak and was caught trying to bury kernels in the garden like a squirrel. Aunt claimed she also once followed a mailman for half a kilometer before realizing he wasn't Grandma. We watched her settle down again, feet neatly tucked, tail feathers swaying slightly in the wind. "I think she's nesting," I said. "Don't say that," Aunt groaned. Sure enough, over the next hour, the occasional cluck from above was joined by a faint scratching sound. I imagined her moving roof tiles with her feet like she was fluffing up invisible straw. Meanwhile, the other chickens seemed content to stay put. They barely moved. Every so often, one would flap its wings just enough to stir the air and send another feather drifting down to the porch. Grandpa sipped his tea and glanced toward the horizon. "They've picked their roost," I frowned, "on a slanted roof. Higher ground, wider view. Terrible footing. They know where not to step." I sighed. "They're chickens, Grandpa." And yet he said they've managed to climb higher than we have today. I couldn't argue with that. The sun began dipping toward the trees, casting long shadows across the grass. A cool breeze swept through the yard, rustling the persimmon leaves and sending another wave of feathers fluttering to the earth. The air felt like it had tilted slightly the way it does just before something shifts. Then Button stood again. This time she didn't pace. She stared out toward the open field behind the house, the wind pushing gently against her feathers. Then, without warning, she flapped her wings once loud and sudden and lifted just enough to reposition herself on a new tile. "She's scouting," I said. "For what?" Territory. Grandpa raised an eyebrow. Maybe she's planning a second story coop. I laughed. It was absurd, sure, but something about it made sense. I spent the rest of the evening on the porch watching the sky turn a deeper blue, the roof fading into silhouette, the chickens nothing more than faint shapes now. Their presence felt oddly reassuring, like little sentinels keeping watch over the house. Aunt came out one last time with a flashlight and a towel over her shoulder. They're staying up there all night, aren't they? Grandpa simply said, looks like it. What if it rains? Then they'll learn. And if they don't, they'll still be chickens, just wetter. I stayed until the first stars blinked into view. The chickens didn't come down, and I couldn't help wondering what dreams they might be having up there, high above the earth, nestled between old roof tiles and the cool night air. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, the kind of early where the sky is still a pale wash of gray and the crickets haven't fully given up their shift yet. I sat up in my futon and listened. No clattering, no frantic squawking. Just silence, soft and full, like the world had pressed the snooze button on everything. I crept out of bed, tiptoed across the cold wooden floor, and slid open the window. The roof was quiet. For a moment, I wondered if the chickens had finally come down in the night. But then, just as the wind rustled through the persimmon tree, I saw it a flutter of feathers and the faintest movement near the ridge. They were still up there, all three. Still. The one that looked like miso was curled into a perfect little circle. The other had her beak tucked under her wing. But Button was awake, perched in the same exact spot as before, eyes half open like some kind of feathery watchman greeting the dawn. I padded outside and stood barefoot on the porch. The grass was soaked in dew, and a light mist hovered near the ground, like it wasn't sure whether to rise or fall. Still holding the high ground, huh? I whispered. No reply, of course. Not even a cluck. Just Button blinking slowly, and somewhere beyond the orchard, the first call of a morning dove. As the sun stretched its arms across the sky, Grandpa stepped outside, yawning and rubbing his neck. They didn't move, he asked. Not a feather, I said. He nodded like this confirmed some long-held theory of his. Then he pointed to the corner of the roof. See that? I followed his finger and spotted a small pile of straw nestled between two tiles. Nestled within it were 3 pale brown eggs, one of them still warm enough to glisten. I gasped. Did she really? Looks like Button decided the roof's as good a place as any. Aunt came out next, holding a basket of laundry and frowning before she'd even looked up. They're still, oh, for heaven's sake, eggs now. Grandma, who had already begun boiling water inside, called out, if they're laying on the roof, we're going to need a broom with a net. No, Grandpa said calmly. Let her be. That spot's hers now. Aunt stared. You want her to live up there? If she wants to. I kept staring at the nest, amazed. It was wedged perfectly in a slight dip between 2 overlapping tiles, safe from wind, invisible from below, and apparently ideal for chicken dreams. We didn't have a way to get up there easily, and even if we did, something about the look in Button's eyes made me hesitate. It wasn't fear or defiance, just ownership. She'd claimed that spot, laid her eggs, watched the valley wake up from a rooftop view. Grandpa sat down beside me and began peeling an orange with his thumbnail, the citrus scent sharp in the cool air. When I was a boy, he said there was a farmer in the next village over who claimed his chickens lived in the rafters of his barn. Really, I asked. He nodded, said it made the eggs taste better. Sky laid. Said you could taste the breeze in the yolk. I laughed. That sounds completely made up. Oh, it was, he replied. But people believed it. Paid extra even. Aunt groaned from behind us. Don't give Button ideas. Next thing we know, she'll charge rent for the rooftop. Button fluffed her feathers as if she'd heard. Later that day, I saw Grandma quietly placing a small dish of water on the corner of the porch railing, angled just enough so it could catch the light and reflect upward. Just in case she gets thirsty, she said without looking at me. We didn't collect the eggs. Not that day. It felt rude. Instead, Grandpa declared that corner tile hers. He even gave it a name, Tenku no Nido, the nest in the sky. It sounded a little too poetic for something sitting on sun-warmed clay and chicken fluff, but it stuck. For the rest of the day, the chickens remained quiet, lounging in their elevated paradise, occasionally ruffling their feathers or shifting positions as if deciding which view they preferred. And once, just before dusk, I saw Button stand tall on her perch wings, half open, watching the wind stir the tall grass below, as if reminding us all, up is sometimes the better place. The next few days passed in a rhythm only a countryside household could understand, slow, repetitive, full of quiet rituals. The chickens surprisingly kept their new habits. Button and her companions remained overhead, descending only once in a while to peck at grain or take a dust bath before flapping their way back up with a kind of gentle stubbornness. We got used to it. I'd sit on the porch doing nothing in particular, watching their shadows move along the roof tiles as the sun shifted. Sometimes I'd bring a book but not read it. Sometimes I'd bring a snack and end up sharing crumbs with the hens that passed through the yard like they owned the place. But no matter what the others did, scratching, clucking, pacing, Button remained queen of the roof. She slept there, nested there, and had even begun rearranging her little pile of straw and leaves with almost artistic intention. She never clucked much. She just watched the house, the fields, the sky, watching like she understood something we didn't. And yet, despite all this calm, Aunt wasn't having it. One morning, I came outside to see her dragging a ladder across the yard like she was storming a castle. I am not dealing with rooftop eggs every week, she huffed. And she's not paying rent. I glanced up. Button was standing tall wings, slightly puffed, watching Aunt approach with a gaze that said, "You dare." "She'll just fly off," I warned. Aunt snorted. "We'll see about that." Grandpa stepped out just in time, holding a rice ball in one hand and a cup of miso in the other. "You're going to climb all the way up there?" he asked. "If I have to," Aunt muttered. "To steal her eggs? To reclaim our roof?" Grandpa looked at the ladder, then at Button. "She's not hurting anyone. She's setting a precedent," Aunt replied. "Next thing you know, they'll be lining up in rows like pigeons." Grandpa took a thoughtful bite of his rice ball. "I say we let her be. You want to get her down, offer her something worth leaving for." Aunt narrowed her eyes. "Like what chicken opera?" He pointed to the kitchen. "Rice scraps. Dried sardines. She likes those." So we tried it. For the next hour, we put together the most ridiculous assortment of offerings you've ever seen warm. Rice topped with pickled plum, a saucer of fermented soybeans, even a small pile of sesame crackers Grandma swore Button once tried to steal from her basket. We laid it all out on a bamboo tray and placed it on a raised stool under the edge of the roof. Then we waited, and waited, and waited. Button didn't move. She glanced at the tray once, then turned her head away like a queen declining a poorly presented tribute. "She's impossible," Aunt muttered, retreating into the kitchen. Later that afternoon, Grandpa and I were sitting under the persimmon tree, listening to the gentle creak of the windmill in the distance. He had just finished polishing one of his old garden tools and was now absently tossing small pebbles toward a tin can for no reason other than rhythm. "You know," he said, "some animals just need their own space, even if that space is the roof." He nodded, especially then. I laid back in the grass, watching Button's silhouette against the soft blue sky. I wish I understood why she went up there in the first place. Maybe she wanted to see the world from a different angle. That's a very grandpa thing to say. He chuckled. "And what would you do if you were her?" I thought for a moment. I guess I'd stay up there too, just to see how long I could last. Grandpa nodded again, and we lapsed into silence. That night, just after dinner, I stood outside brushing my teeth with salt, watching the stars come out one by one. The chickens were already settling in for sleep, and Button had gone completely still, a perfect mound of feathers silhouetted against the twilight sky. She looked like a weather vane, unmoving, watching. The wind picked up gently, and for a moment I thought I heard a soft, breathy cluck. Not a sound of complaint, more like a sigh. And I started to wonder if Button even remembered what it was like to be a ground chicken, or if after all this time the roof felt more like home than anywhere else. That night the rain came quietly. No thunder, no lightning, just the soft, steady rhythm of drops tapping on the roof tiles, sliding down the eaves, and collecting in the rusted watering cans beneath the porch. I woke to the sound and instinctively pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, listening to the house breathe around me. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked under the weight of the wind. And somewhere above us on the roof, I wondered, was Button still there? I slipped out of bed and padded to the window, breath fogging the glass. The sky was a uniform gray, the kind of pale blue you get just before sunrise. Rain misted the air like steam, and the orchard beyond was soft-edged as if painted with wet brushes. I squinted upward, trying to find the familiar shape. There, just barely visible in the rain, Button hunched like a determined umbrella, feathers soaked, but body still. She hadn't moved. "She's really doing it," I whispered. I went downstairs, stepping over the squeaky spot in the floorboard so I wouldn't wake Aunt, and crept out onto the porch. Rain pittered on the wooden railing. The bamboo wind chime above gave a hollow thunk with every sway. I looked up again. The two other chickens were gone, probably taking shelter somewhere under the porch, or in one of Grandpa's forgotten storage crates. But Button remained on the roof, tucked in tight against her little nest, eyes closed, head turned toward the drizzle. Behind me, I heard the quiet slide of the door. Grandpa joined me, wrapped in his old green robe, holding two tiny ceramic cups. He handed one to me, warm barley tea. "She didn't come down?" he asked. I shook my head. "She's still up there, soaked." He sipped his tea, watching the sky lighten. "She's guarding something." "You think it's the eggs?" "She chose that spot, and once a creature chooses its place, it's hard to pull it away." We sat there in silence for a while, just watching the rain. Eventually, Button ruffled her feathers, stood up, and gave herself one mighty shake, sending droplets flying in all directions. Then she did the strangest thing. She stretched her wings out wide slowly, like a sun salutation, and let the rain soak every feather. "She's not hiding from the storm," I whispered. "She's part of it." Grandpa nodded. "Some birds chase shelter, others just let the weather pass through them." The wind picked up a little, and the mist thickened into proper rain. Button finally moved. She stepped carefully across the tiles, flapped once, then twice, and finally took to the air. It wasn't graceful. Chickens rarely are. But she glided down just enough to land in the tall grass beside the persimmon tree, shook off the last of the water, and strutted toward the porch like she'd simply returned from a short journey. "She made it," I said. "She always would," Grandpa replied. I opened the sliding door and let her hop inside. She didn't seem to care that the floor was freshly swept. She went straight for the warmest corner by the stove and settled in like nothing had happened. Later that morning, when Aunt finally emerged and saw the trail of muddy chicken prints leading through the kitchen, she let out a sigh so deep it made the curtains tremble. "I suppose this means she's back." "For now," I said, pouring warm rice into her bowl. But there was still one egg up there. After breakfast, I grabbed the ladder, and with Aunt watching suspiciously from the porch, I climbed up carefully, each rung wet and a little slippery. Grandpa stood below, arms crossed, not saying a word, but clearly watching every step. The nest was a soggy mess, but the egg sat unharmed in the middle, glistening like a pearl. I picked it up and held it in my palm. It felt warm, like a secret that hadn't quite finished being told. When I brought it down, Grandma took it from me gently and placed it in a small porcelain bowl lined with a clean cloth. "She might want it back," she said. That night, we left the egg near the base of the porch where Button liked to sit. She didn't even look at it. Just puffed her feathers, made a slow turn in place, and closed her eyes, as if to say, that part's done now. After the rain, everything smelled new again. The dirt was soft and dark, the air had that wash-clean quiet to it, and the moss between the stepping stones looked just a bit greener than usual. The chickens took full advantage of the softened ground, pecking and scratching like they'd never seen a puddle in their lives. But Button was different. She didn't race back to the coop with the others. She didn't run for the seed tray or fluff herself in the dirt. Instead, she circled the yard once, then wandered straight back toward the house, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps and looking up at the roof. "Don't even think about it," Aunt warned from the doorway, holding a damp mop. Button blinked, then sat, not on the roof this time, just there, at the base of the stairs. Grandpa stepped outside with a dish of water and set it beside her. She took one sip, then turned her head toward the orchard, calm and still. We all waited for her next move. For hours, she didn't budge. She just sat there like a little weathered guardian, feathers still damp in places, watching the breeze move through the grass. That afternoon, while helping Grandma sort dried persimmons in the kitchen, I asked, "Do you think she'll go back up?" "Maybe," she said, "but she won't nest there again. Storms do that. Make you change your mind. Make you see the world differently." Button didn't return to the roof that day or the next. She found a new favorite spot behind the stone water basin, where the sun hit just right in the mornings. Sometimes she sat in the shade beneath the persimmon tree, but she never again climbed higher than a fence post. One evening, I found Grandpa smoothing out the ground beneath the porch with the side of a broom. He was humming something low and slow, and I noticed he was carving a small ring in the dirt with a stick. "A nest?" I asked. He smiled. "She might want a new one, but she's not laying there. Still nice to have the option." I sat beside him, poking at a pebble. "She really did it, huh? Chose the roof, chose to stay, chose to leave." Grandpa nodded. "That's what makes it hers." Later that week, we found the second egg. Not on the roof this time, but tucked under the old wooden bench beside the rain barrel. Button had covered it with bits of straw and grass, just like before, but this time on solid ground. Grandma picked it up, carefully smiled, and said, "Now she's grounded." Aunt rolled her eyes. "Let's hope she stays that way." We didn't speak much more about it, but Grandpa quietly repaired the broken roof tile where the first nest had been. He patched it with fresh clay, and then, almost as an afterthought, etched a small curved line into it. A gentle arc, like a feather or a smile. He didn't say what it meant, and I didn't ask. But I liked that it was there. Sometimes I'd look up at that spot from the yard, watching the sun warm the tile, and think about how small things can seem enormous when they happen above your head, and how sometimes the ones who seem the most stubborn are just waiting for the wind to shift. Button returned to her usual routine in time. She pecked at gravel paths, followed Grandma to the vegetable patch, and even started clucking at the laundry again, as if giving commentary on the socks. But now and then she'd still pause, look toward the roof, not longingly, just with quiet memory. And when she did, I imagined she wasn't thinking about the rain or the cold tiles beneath her. I imagined she was remembering how it felt to sit above the world just for a while. As the season crept toward winter, the air turned sharper, and the orchard dropped its last stubborn leaves. Grandpa began stacking firewood by the kitchen door again, and Grandma switched from barley tea to roasted sweet potato soup in the evenings. Even the chickens seemed to grow quieter, fluffier, content to huddle in corners and blink slowly at the wind. And Button, our rooftop adventurer, seemed to have settled for good. Her days now followed a routine so steady you could have set a clock by it. Morning sun near the persimmon tree mid-afternoon, beside the rain barrel, and evenings tucked neatly behind the tool shed in a hollow of dry leaves. She hadn't looked at the roof in weeks, at least not until that morning. I had been sweeping the porch when I saw her standing, perfectly still, eyes fixed on the tile Grandpa had patched, the one with the curve etched into it. She didn't move toward it, just stared, then blinked, and turned away. I don't know why that moment stayed with me. Maybe it was the way she stood, like someone looking back at an old photograph. Maybe it was how she seemed satisfied, like she had nothing left to prove. I told Grandpa about it later that night while we shelled chestnuts by the fire. He chuckled. Even chickens remember things, especially things they choose. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling softly. The light danced across the floorboards, and from outside came the occasional shuffle of feathers as the chickens resettled for the night. Then Grandpa added, "There's a kind of strength in coming back down, too." I looked at him. "You mean stronger than staying up there?" "Sometimes," he said. "It's easy to rise, harder to return, especially when people start expecting you to stay up." He tapped the shell of a chestnut gently before cracking it open with his thumb. "You don't have to stay in the sky forever to prove you belong there." That night I dreamed of Button again, but not on the roof. This time she was walking beside me through the orchard, leading the way down a narrow path I didn't remember ever seeing. Her feathers were a little ruffled from the wind, but she moved steadily, each step purposeful, like she knew exactly where we were going. I followed without asking. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was look toward the roof. Empty. Peacefully so. The patched tile caught the light just right, faintly golden, a little rough at the edge, but still holding firm. I stood there a while, breathing in the cold air, letting it fill my chest the way the quiet always did. Later that day, Grandpa surprised me by bringing out a small wooden box. Inside was the egg Button had laid during the storm, carefully cleaned and hollowed out, preserved like a keepsake. He carved a little stand for it too, made from a piece of persimmon branch. She left it for us, he said simply, so we'd remember. We placed it on the kitchen shelf near the tea tins, right next to a tiny pine cone I'd found during one of our walks. Grandma didn't say anything when she saw it. She just dusted around it and smiled. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the hill, I found Button nestled into her leaf bed, feathers rising and falling with her slow breaths. I knelt beside her, gave a soft whistle, our old signal, and she opened one eye, then closed it again. She was home, on the ground, by choice, and that somehow made all the difference. As the season crept toward winter, the air turned sharper, and the orchard dropped its last stubborn leaves. Grandpa began stacking firewood by the kitchen door again, and Grandma switched from barley tea to roasted sweet potato soup in the evenings. Even the chickens seemed to grow quieter, fluffier, content to huddle in corners and blink slowly at the wind. And Button, our rooftop adventurer, seemed to have settled for good. Her days now followed a routine so steady you could have set a clock by it. Morning sun near the persimmon tree mid-afternoon, beside the rain barrel, and evenings tucked neatly behind the tool shed in a hollow of dry leaves. She hadn't looked at the roof in weeks, at least not until that morning. I had been sweeping the porch when I saw her standing, perfectly still, eyes fixed on the tile Grandpa had patched, the one with the curve etched into it. She didn't move toward it, just stared, then blinked, and turned away. I don't know why that moment stayed with me. Maybe it was the way she stood, like someone looking back at an old photograph. Maybe it was how she seemed satisfied, like she had nothing left to prove. I told Grandpa about it later that night while we shelled chestnuts by the fire. He chuckled. Even chickens remember things, especially things they choose. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling softly. The light danced across the floorboards, and from outside came the occasional shuffle of feathers as the chickens resettled for the night. Then Grandpa added, "There's a kind of strength in coming back down too." I looked at him. "You mean stronger than staying up there?" "Sometimes," he said, "it's easy to rise, harder to return, especially when people start expecting you to stay up." He tapped the shell of a chestnut gently before cracking it open with his thumb. "You don't have to stay in the sky forever to prove you belong there." That night I dreamed of Button again, but not on the roof. This time she was walking beside me through the orchard, leading the way down a narrow path I didn't remember ever seeing. Her feathers were a little ruffled from the wind, but she moved steadily, each step purposeful, like she knew exactly where we were going. I followed without asking. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was look toward the roof. Empty. Peacefully so. The patched tile caught the light just right, faintly golden, a little rough at the edge, but still holding firm. I stood there a while, breathing in the cold air, letting it fill my chest the way the quiet always did. Later that day, Grandpa surprised me by bringing out a small wooden box. Inside was the egg Button had laid during the storm, carefully cleaned and hollowed out, preserved like a keepsake. He'd carved a little stand for it too, made from a piece of persimmon branch. "She left it for us," he said simply, "so we'd remember." We placed it on the kitchen shelf near the tea tins, right next to a tiny pine cone I'd found during one of our walks. Grandma didn't say anything when she saw it. She just dusted around it and smiled. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the hill, I found Button nestled into her leaf bed, feathers rising and falling with her slow breaths. I knelt beside her, gave a soft whistle, our old signal, and she opened one eye, then closed it again. She was home, on the ground, by choice, and that somehow made all the difference. The word count 1056, relaxing conclusion, 300 words. And now, as the sky dims and the shadows stretch softly across the yard, let's let the house grow still again. The kettle simmers quietly on the stove. Grandpa hums some wordless tune you half remember while the chickens make their soft, rhythmic rustles in the dark corners of the garden. The roof is empty now, but not forgotten. Because sometimes the most remarkable moments don't last forever. They perch for a while, just like Button did, high above the world, then flutter back down when the time is right. Not in defeat, but in understanding. Let the quiet nestle around you like straw in a hollowed corner. Let the memory of soft feathers drifting through morning mist wrap around your thoughts like a blanket pulled up to your chin. You're safe here, with the patched tiles above the egg on the shelf and the steady rhythm of footsteps that know every creak in the floorboards. Breathe in slow, let it out even slower, and if tomorrow feels a little uncertain, just remember Button. Brave enough to climb, wise enough to come down, and calm enough to simply sit still when it mattered most. Sleep easy now. Sweet dreams.